At my sister's wedding, I stood in the corner, clutching a glass of champagne I could barely taste. The laughter carried across the room wasn't joyful, it was sharp, cutting, and aimed straight at me. My mother's voice rang out, dripping with scorn. "Her husband is just imaginary." My sister smirked, tossing her bouquet of white roses from hand to hand, and added for everyone to hear, "Don't turn my big day into a joke." Their words echoed like daggers, and the guests laughed nervously, some avoiding my eyes, others watching to see how I'd react. But I didn't give them the satisfaction. I swallowed every ounce of humiliation in silence, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the string quartet in the background. What none of them knew, what they could never have imagined, was that the truth was about to arrive in a way that would shatter every cruel word they had ever spoken about me. Because just as my sister and mother basked in their mockery, the thunder of a helicopter cut through the clear evening sky. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, and the color drained from faces that only moments before were smug with ridicule. When the rotor blades slowed and the door opened, he stepped out. Not imaginary, not a joke. Real, powerful, undeniable. With every stride toward me, the balance of power in that room shifted. And when he clasped my hand and declared in a voice strong enough for every guest to hear, "My wife," the entire wedding fell silent. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about reclaiming dignity, about what happens when years of cruelty meet the undeniable truth. By the end, you'll know why that silence was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Margaret Evans was 32 years old, a woman who had spent the last decade carving out a career that was hers alone. She ran a boutique branding agency in New York, working with small companies that trusted her ability to turn vision into image. To her clients, she was steady, professional, and dependable, but when she stepped back into the orbit of her family, she was no longer that self-made woman. She was the elder daughter who never quite measured up, the child who had spent her life in comparison to someone else. That duality lived inside her like a shadow, one that lengthened each time she crossed paths with her parents or her younger sister. The echoes of the wedding's cruel laughter still lingered in her memory, but the roots of that humiliation reached much further back. Margaret had grown up under the constant weight of comparison. From the earliest days of grade school, Diane and Robert made it clear that their younger daughter, Emily, was the standard to which Margaret would always be held. It began with small comments, slipped into ordinary moments. Emily's handwriting was neater. Emily's math grades were higher. Emily's smile was brighter. At first, Margaret had tried to shrug it off, determined to shine in her own way. She sketched for hours, filling page after page with designs that spoke to her. She dreamed of studying art, of creating something beautiful, of building a future around her imagination. But each time she shared that dream, her parents dismissed it as a childish indulgence. Diane, her mother, had a way of smiling tightly when Margaret spoke about design, as if humoring a child's fantasy. "Art is lovely, dear, but Emily is going to law school," she would say, her voice heavy with pride whenever Emily's name entered the conversation. Robert was harsher, though never loud. His disappointment came as quiet judgment, a shake of the head, a flat statement that left no room for argument. "Law is the future. Design won't put food on the table." The words carried a finality that erased Margaret's protests before they formed. It was not anger that cut her down, but certainty, the kind that left her feeling both invisible and wrong for even wanting something different. One memory in particular haunted her, a night that returned often when she least expected it. It was Christmas, the house glowing with colored lights, the smell of cinnamon and pine drifting through every room. Relatives gathered around the living room, laughter rising with the crackle of the fire. Margaret had prepared for that evening, clutching a folder of her latest sketches. She had entered a regional design contest, and for the first time, felt her work might truly be recognized. As the family settled with mugs of cocoa, she found her courage and began to share. She spoke about the contest, her voice tentative but hopeful, holding out the drawings for her grandparents, her cousins, her parents to see. She had barely finished the first sentence when Diane's voice sliced through hers. "Everyone! Emily has been selected as a finalist in the state debate championship," Diane announced, her face alight with pride. Applause erupted, the room filling with congratulations, questions, and praise for Emily's achievement. Margaret's words dissolved into the noise. The folder drooped in her hands, her sketches unnoticed, her moment erased in an instant. She stood there, cheeks burning, forcing a polite smile as Emily basked in the spotlight. No one asked about the contest. No one looked at the designs. Margaret quietly slipped her folder onto a side table, the pages sliding against the wood with a sound that only she seemed to hear. That was the night she understood what it meant to be overshadowed so completely that her triumphs became invisible. Moments like that did not fade with time. They stacked like stones in her memory, heavy and unyielding. Each family gathering reinforced the same pattern: Emily as the shining star, Margaret as the afterthought. Even as an adult, with clients who valued her work and a business that paid her bills, she carried the weight of those dismissals. It was not that she doubted her talent. It was that her parents had never recognized it, and that wound never healed. The child inside her, silenced on Christmas night, still lived within the woman who smiled politely at cocktail parties and returned to her apartment alone. Now, as she prepared for Emily's wedding, those memories pressed in closer than ever. The invitation had arrived with a flourish, embossed in gold, the kind of lavish gesture that reflected both Emily's taste and Diane's pride. Margaret had read it twice, noting how the wording framed the event as not only Emily and Mark's day, but as a celebration of the Evans family. It was not just a wedding. It was a statement of status, of triumph, of everything Margaret was not. She could have declined, could have spared herself the inevitable comparisons, the whispers, the questions about her absent husband, but she knew her absence would be noted, gossiped about, turned into another mark against her. So she accepted, though her heart sank the moment she dropped the reply card into the mailbox. On the day of the wedding, the venue stood as a monument to grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, flowers cascaded down marble staircases, and waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays. Guests murmured about the cost, about the spectacle, about how Emily had truly outdone herself. Margaret walked through the doors with a calm expression, her green dress simple but elegant, her hair swept into a low bun. Outwardly, she blended into the scene, just another well-dressed guest. Inwardly, she carried the weight of decades, each slight and dismissal folded neatly into her composure. She knew she would not be celebrated that night. She knew the eyes of her parents would glide past her as they always had. Yet she also knew something had shifted within her. She no longer sought their approval, though their cruelty still cut. She was bracing herself for what she suspected was coming, another humiliation in a lifetime of humiliations. As she stood among the guests, watching her sister glow in her bridal gown, Margaret felt the sting of the past and the pressure of the present collide. The room was filled with laughter, but to her, it was sharp and brittle, echoing too closely the voices that had silenced her since childhood. She held her glass of champagne, its bubbles rising and fading, and thought of every time she had been dismissed. This wedding was not only Emily's grand moment. It was the stage upon which Margaret would once again be forced to confront the family narrative that had defined her since she was a girl. What she did not yet realize was that this time, the story would not end the way her parents expected. This time, the silence she had carried for so long would give way to a truth they could not ignore. The ceremony had unfolded with perfect precision, each detail polished to reflect Emily's version of perfection. Guests circulated with glasses of champagne, their conversations humming above the soft music from the quartet. Margaret remained composed at her table, her green dress catching the glow of the chandeliers, her back straight despite the weight she carried. The sting of old wounds pressed against her, but she willed herself to stay steady. For a while, she succeeded. She listened. She nodded politely. She smiled when expected. Then came the inevitable question. the one she had anticipated yet dreaded with every fiber of her being. A woman seated at the next table leaned toward Diane, her voice hushed but not quiet enough. "And what about your older daughter? We've heard she's married. Will her husband be joining us tonight?" The question was not cruel in itself, but it opened a door that Margaret knew her mother would be all too eager to step through. Diane's eyes flicked toward her eldest, a glance cool as glass, and then she smiled thinly. The words came without hesitation, loud enough to reach not only the curious guest, but several others nearby. "Her husband is just imaginary," she said. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. The guest who had asked widened her eyes, unsure how to respond. A ripple passed through those within earshot. Margaret's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay still. Her mother's voice had carried deliberately, sharp and unforgiving, leaving no room for misunderstanding. It was not merely a remark, it was an indictment, one spoken for the benefit of the crowd. Emily, radiant in her bridal gown, caught the current and seized it as though it had been planned. She shifted the bouquet of roses from one hand to the other, her lips curving into a smirk. "Please," she said, her voice lilting but cutting, "don't turn my wedding into a comedy. I don't want my big day overshadowed by my sister's fantasies." The words landed with the precision of a blade. A few guests stifled awkward chuckles. Some turned their heads as though searching for escape, but others leaned in, eager to catch more of the drama unfolding. Margaret's chest burned. She could feel her pulse hammering against the delicate chain at her neck, but she kept her eyes steady, her posture calm. It was the only defense she had left. To argue would be to descend to their level, to grant them more fuel. To protest would be twisted into evidence of her fragility. And so she swallowed hard and remained still. Then Mark, the groom himself, felt compelled to add his voice. Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps nerves, or perhaps his need to impress his new in-laws, but his tone carried a casual cruelty that made the sting of Diane's and Emily's words feel like embers compared to fire. "If he's real," Mark said with a grin that flashed beneath the lights, "I'll kneel down right here and apologize in front of everyone." He lifted his glass in mock salute, his voice pitched high enough to carry across several tables. Laughter followed, uneven but unmistakable. Mark approached Margaret's table, his whiskey glass clinking on the linen. "I just want clarity," he said, voice low but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "If your husband's real, why hasn't anyone seen him? No dinners, no calls. It's starting to feel like a story you tell yourself." His smile was sharp, his words a dare. "If he's real, I'll kneel and apologize right here." Margaret met his gaze, her face calm, her silence deliberate. "Enjoy your evening," she said evenly, refusing to take the bait. The challenge hung in the air, but she held her ground, her composure a shield. Mark shrugged, satisfied with his jab, and turned away, unaware that the truth was closer than he thought. He straightened, smoothed his tie, and reclaimed his glass. "No hard feelings," he said in a tone that ensured there would be. "We're family now." He tapped the rim against the air, a private toast no one returned. "Try to relax, It's a celebration." Then he pivoted toward the dance floor with the comfortable swagger of a man who thinks the room belongs to him. The little circle of listeners uncoiled and pretended to wander away. Their conversations resumed in fragments that drifted back like flotsam. 2 years? No one's seen him? Well, if she lied, maybe he's embarrassed. Or married. The guesses multiplied and contradicted each other as gossip always does. The sting lay not in any one speculation, but in the simple pleasure people took in having something to say. Margaret realized she was breathing too shallowly and forced a fuller inhale. Her face was hot, yes, but the heat had changed temperature. It no longer felt like shame. It felt like a forge. She reached for her clutch, not to check her phone, not to run, but to feel the solid weight of it in her hand. Evidence that she was here in the present, and not 12 years old at a Christmas party where no one looked at her drawings. Behind her, the quartet shifted into another melody, and the MC's voice rose, cheerful and practiced, asking guests to take their seats for toasts. On cue, the room flowed back toward the tables. Somewhere across the room, Emily laughed, high and bright, and just brittle enough to make Glass nervous. Diane floated toward a cluster of relatives, her smile arranged, her pearls steady. Mark, now shoulder to shoulder with two groomsmen, told some story that made them clap him on the back. He did not look toward Margaret again. He didn't need to. He believed he had finished what he came to do. Margaret kept her eyes on the folded napkin in front of her. The blush would fade. She knew that. The hush would pass. They always do. What didn't pass was resolve. She tasted it now. Clean as cold water, as steadying as a hand placed at the small of the back. She would not answer cruelty with noise. She would not barter truth for a moment's relief. The room could feed on rumor a little longer if it wanted. Let it. Some meals end abruptly when the lights come on. Rachel returned and set a fresh glass of water on the table. She didn't ask what had been said. She didn't need to. Breathe, she murmured. I am, Margaret replied, and realized she finally was. She lifted the glass and drank, the simple act as intentional as a vow. Around them, the clink of silver and the murmur of guests braided into a familiar wedding soundscape. Over the MC's shoulder, a door to the terrace stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, the evening was a deep, polished blue. Margaret felt something in her settle, a single still note beneath the orchestra of noise. She set down her glass and folded her hands. She would not move first. She didn't have to. The next move would belong to something larger than gossip and sharper than mockery. She could feel it coming, the way a sailor feels the change in air before a storm. Margaret waited until the room found its rhythm again, before she stood. The toasts were about to begin. A bridesmaid flitted past with a fistful of note cards. The MC rehearsed a line under his breath, and the quartet softened its playing to a polite shimmer. She smoothed the skirt of her dress and told herself she would only step out for air, a few minutes at most, a simple act of mercy for a heart that had been hammered all evening. The terrace door stood ajar, letting in a wash of cooler air and the faint scent of roses. She moved toward it with the reflex of someone who has learned to leave before the next blow lands. Halfway there, a familiar silhouette slid into her path. Robert. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Authority clung to him like starch to a collar. He held a glass of bourbon by the stem, the liquid barely disturbed as he planted himself between Margaret and the exit. Leaving now? He asked, tone neutral, eyes already broadcasting judgment. He didn't wait for an answer. Stay. Don't give people something to talk about. The words struck with the cold efficiency of a gavel. Margaret stopped short. For a heartbeat, she considered walking around him without a word. Instead, she met his gaze and found nothing there that resembled concern. No curiosity about what had been said to her. No flicker of anger on her behalf. Only calculation. The careful arithmetic of appearances. Dad, she said, and even to her own ears the word sounded like a formality, not a relationship. He glanced toward the room, already measuring optics. It's your sister's wedding, he said. You walk out during the toasts, and all anyone will remember is the scene. We won't have that. He sipped, as if to emphasize that this was not a conversation, but a ruling. Up close, she noticed the precise part in his gray hair, the cufflinks Diane had given him on their last anniversary, the entire presentation of a man who had built his life around control. He did not ask why she needed air. He did not ask how she was. He did not even ask whether anything he'd heard earlier had been true. He simply protected the family name from a problem named Margaret. Something inside her slumped, then straightened. The child who once reached for his approval felt the familiar sag of disappointment. The woman who had learned to steady herself felt something else, a clean line being drawn. She nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement of what had always been true. I wasn't planning a scene, she said quietly. Good, he replied, already turning his head back toward the stage where the MC lifted a hand for quiet. Then sit. Smile. Be gracious." He stepped aside just enough to let her pass, not toward the terrace, but back into the grid of round tables, where the place cards bore names in calligraphy, like a list of those who mattered. Margaret returned to her seat, each step measured. The room had brightened, as the house lights rose a notch for the speeches. Waiters refilled water glasses with swift efficiency. The bridesmaid with the note cards had lined them up in color order on the sweetheart table, as if that could organize the feelings that were about to be spoken. Somewhere a microphone squealed and then behaved. Margaret folded her napkin over her lap and let her hands rest on the fabric, palms open, as if she were a vessel, and calm might pour in. She considered the door again out of the corner of her eye. She could still stand, still glide through it, still vanish into the evening, and let the night do what it wanted without her. She pictured herself in a taxi, the venue shrinking in the rear window, the city opening its arms. She almost tasted the relief of being elsewhere. But the image curdled when she saw, in her mind's eye, Diane's mouth tightening, Emily's triumphant smile, Mark's shrugging pity. She thought of the group chat Maria had shown her, the gleeful certainty that she would always provide them with material. If she left, she would become the story they wanted. If she stayed, she could become the ending they didn't expect. The MC welcomed the first speaker, Emily's maid of honor, who burst into tears 2 sentences in and recovered with a laugh that charmed the room. Laughter rippled, glasses chimed. Margaret listened as if from a distance. The words flowed, the memories were rinsed and polished. The love was declared as publicly as money could stage it. She felt her father's presence a few tables away, rigid and satisfied, now that the evening marched on according to plan. She felt Diane's gaze skitter past her as if she were a chair leg, and Emily's rest against Mark with the ease of possession. And she felt, beneath all of it, a truth that settled like a stone in a riverbed. He had not told her to stay for her. He had told her to stay for them. That knowledge did not make her leave. It made her still. She had been still before, with less to hold on to. Tonight, stillness was not absence, it was intention. She straightened a place card. She lifted her glass, only water, and took a small sip. She set it down carefully, centered it above the knife. If anyone looked at her now, they would see a woman at a wedding reception, practicing perfect manners. They would not see the calculations unspooling beneath her calm. She let a single sentence anchor her, silent as prayer. If I am quiet, the truth will speak for me. The speeches warmed the room. Mark's best man told a safe story about a college prank. Diane spoke with a trembling voice about daughters and destiny, pointedly avoiding Margaret's eyes. Robert delivered a crisp toast about tradition, the sort of speech that could be pasted into any program and offend no one. Each word was applauded on cue. Each sentiment evaporated almost at once. Margaret felt none of it reach her. She sat with her hands composed, and her face untroubled. And with each applause, she felt the pressure in the air rise, as if the ballroom itself were building towards something it could not name. A server leaned in to clear a plate, and whispered, "You all right, ma'am?" So softly Margaret almost wondered if she imagined it. She nodded once, and the young woman nodded back, an ally made of a single human moment. Beyond the windows, dusk had deepened into velvet. The garden lights flickered on, throwing lacework shadows across the lawn. Somewhere outside, a mechanical hum stirred in the distance, indistinct at first, like a rumor trying to become a fact. Margaret did not turn her head. She felt it more than heard it, a pressure at the edge of the world she occupied. Inside, the MC lifted his glass for the final toast before dinner service. "To the bride and groom," he announced, beaming. "To love that is seen and celebrated." The phrase snagged in the air. Margaret's hand tightened on the stem of her water glass. She thought of the message thread Maria had sent, of her mother's laughter in the hallway, of Mark's promise made like a dare. She thought of her father's command, of the way duty can be used to kidnap a person's voice and call it grace. And then she released the glass and let her hand rest again, open. The hum outside gathered itself, not yet loud enough to be a certainty, not yet close enough to be a disruption. Inside, candles burned steady over arrangements of cream roses. Somewhere, distant but not far, a sound tested its wings. The room leaned, ever so slightly, toward climax. Margaret breathed and did not move. She didn't need to. The night was preparing its own speech. The MC lifted his glass high, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "To the bride and groom," he began, his smile polished, the quartet softening behind him so the toast could take center stage. Guests raised their flutes in unison, the room holding its breath for that ceremonial clink that would crown the evening. But before the words could land, another sound intruded, a faint vibration, low and steady, threading through the chandeliers and into the floorboards. At first it was subtle, a hum mistaken for a generator, or the rumble of distant thunder. But it persisted, growing louder with each beat, until the delicate crystal in the chandelier chimed against itself, and the candles flickered, as if bowing to an unseen wind. The MC faltered, glass poised, and every eye in the room began to shift upward. The noise sharpened into rhythm, distinct, mechanical, unignorable. Thwump, thwump, thwump. Conversations cut short mid-sentence. A waiter froze with a tray of champagne coupes trembling in his grip. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering questions that carried more unease than answers. A woman near the terrace door pressed her hand to her pearls and asked, "Is that a helicopter?" The suggestion rippled across the crowd like static. Music sputtered and died. The quartet set down their bows. Guests rose from their chairs, craning toward the tall windows where the sound pressed hardest, each pulse vibrating in the glass. Napkins lifted, curtains stirred, and a sudden draft swept through as someone pulled the terrace doors wide. The night rushed in, cool and insistent, carrying with it the unmistakable roar of rotor blades. Diane's chair scraped sharply against the floor as she stood, her voice cutting through the confusion. "This venue doesn't permit landings," she snapped, as if the declaration itself could stop the noise. Her tone was half command, half desperation, her eyes flashing toward the event coordinator already fumbling with her headset. "Do something," she ordered, though the girl could only shake her head helplessly. The sound swelled to a thunder that drowned even thought. Dresses whipped, glasses rattled, and the guests pressed closer to the windows, their awe laced with fear. Some speculated aloud. An emergency, a publicity stunt, perhaps some celebrity late to the party, but no explanation steadied the chaos. The music of the wedding, the polished laughter, the curated joy, all of it had been ripped apart by the force of something descending from the sky. Margaret remained still in her chair, her back straight, her hands calm in her lap. Around her the ballroom shifted into panic and wonder, but she did not flinch. Her eyes held steady on the terrace doors as the rhythm grew heavier, closer, until no one could deny it any longer. A helicopter was coming down onto the very grounds of the estate, blades carving through the night, scattering petals and certainty alike. Every head turned upward. Every whisper fell silent. The party had been transformed in an instant into a stage waiting for its next act. And though no one knew yet what would emerge from that storm of sound, the balance of the evening had already changed. The sky itself had intruded, and the crowd stood spellbound, hoarse with questions, hovering on the brink of revelation. As the stunned silence settled over the wedding hall, all eyes remained fixed on the man who had just uttered the words that had cracked the foundation of every assumption in the room. "My wife." Jonathan's voice still echoed faintly, as though the walls themselves refused to let go of it. Mark, the groom whose smug confidence had dominated the evening just moments before, now stood with his mouth slightly open, a nervous flicker in his eyes. Emily's hand gripped the edge of the dessert table, her smile long gone. Diane's pearl necklace trembled ever so slightly as she forced a tight-lipped expression, struggling to regain composure. But it was Jonathan who moved next unhurried, assured, making his way toward the man who had made Margaret the butt of every cruel joke. He extended his hand to Mark. "We discussed the investment agreement last week," Jonathan said in a tone, so even it only made the tension more unbearable. I trust you still intend to honor it. After all, integrity means keeping your word even when it's inconvenient, doesn't it? Mark, clearly unsure whether to shake the hand or disappear into the floor, eventually offered his own. But the firmness was gone. The bravado, the charm, all of it dissolved under the weight of realization. Murmurs were already beginning to spread like wildfire from one end of the reception to the other. The most powerful man in the room wasn't Mark. It was Jonathan Pierce, and somehow, inexplicably, he was married to the woman everyone had mocked. The revelation took only seconds to register, but the ripple effect was instant. Margaret's name, which had been whispered earlier with skepticism and pity, now carried an entirely new charge. Mark looked as though he'd been punched, trying and failing to form a response. "Yes," Jonathan continued, his tone now colder. "Margaret Evans. The woman you laughed at is the one I love, the one I respect, and the one your so-called rising star has been pitching to for the last 3 quarters, desperate to secure capital before his runway collapses." The shift in the room was palpable. Emily clutched her bouquet tighter, her knuckles white. Diane's expression cracked for a brief moment. Shock, disbelief, then panic. Only Robert remained motionless, lips pressed in a grim line, his silence louder than any defense he might have tried to give. Margaret stood rooted beside Jonathan, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted. She said nothing, but the slight arch of her brow, the way her eyes held steady, sent a message just as powerful as her husband's words. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth had arrived with propellers thundering overhead, and now stood beside her in a tailored black suit. "Let me repeat," Jonathan said, his voice carrying once more. "The man you dismissed, doubted, and denied your imaginary husband is not only real, but also the person your future son-in-law has been trying to impress." Mark staggered a step backward, his mouth twitching as if he were searching for a witty retort but finding nothing. Emily's lips moved slightly, but no sound emerged. She looked at Diane, as if asking silently what to do next. But Diane had no answer. All her calculated insults, her sharp comments, her perfectly rehearsed lines, none of them could stand against a truth this undeniable. And then, as if to seal the moment, Jonathan turned back to Margaret and offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. The crowd parted for them instinctively, not because anyone asked them to, but because reverence had replaced ridicule. Respect had replaced scorn, and the people who had once mocked her were now left staring after her, unsure whether they should apologize, retreat, or simply vanish. Behind them, Mark stood pale and shaken, the promise he'd made to Neil if the man was real now hanging heavy in the air. No one forced him to follow through. No one even mentioned it. But the weight of that broken promise clung to him like a stain he couldn't wash off. In just a few sentences, the power had shifted. The night no longer belonged to Emily and Mark. It belonged to Margaret, the woman they had tried to erase, and to the man who had made sure they could never do it again. Diane's composure, already fragile, cracked under the weight of Jonathan's words. She stepped forward with a desperate smile, her hands fluttering as if she could wave away the humiliation. "We were only worried about her," she said, her tone rehearsed but trembling at the edges. "As parents, we just wanted to protect her, to keep her grounded. We didn't mean any harm." The words spilled into the charged air, thin and brittle, and no one missed how quickly she tried to turn cruelty into concern. It was the instinct of someone used to controlling a story, but this time the story refused to bend. Rachel, who had been quiet until now, straightened in her seat. Her voice carried not just across the table but across the entire hall, crisp and cold. "Worried? You call it worry when you stand in front of 200 people and call your daughter's marriage a fantasy? When you laugh behind her back and mock her in your family chats? That isn't concern, Diane. That's humiliation dressed up in pearls." The cut of her words struck harder than volume ever could, and for the first time all evening, heads turned away from Margaret and fixed squarely on Diane. The silence that followed wasn't supportive. It was condemning. Guests who had once laughed along shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some covered their mouths, whispering to their companions. Others shook their heads, their gazes hardening. Diane's practiced elegance faltered beneath their judgment. The social tide that had always carried her now pulled away, leaving her exposed. Margaret rose then, not hurriedly, not angrily, but with the kind of calm that silences a room without effort. Her eyes locked on her mother first, then her father, and her voice came low but firm, every syllable clear. "I have never lied to you. Not once. I told you about my life, about my work, about the man I loved. You didn't refuse to believe because it wasn't true. You refused because it didn't fit the version of me you wanted." Her words struck with a quiet finality that reverberated louder than any outburst could. All eyes shifted to Robert, waiting for the patriarch to speak. But Robert's mouth tightened, his gaze dropped to the floor, and silence became his only answer. It was not the silence of neutrality, but of retreat, a silence that confirmed guilt far more than words ever could. For years he had let Diane dictate the narrative, and now, when his daughter looked to him for acknowledgement, he gave her nothing. The guests felt the weight of that silence. A man at the far table muttered to his wife, too loudly for discretion, "She deserved better." A young woman shook her head, whispering, "They never wanted her to win." The whispers gathered momentum, a current of disapproval spreading through the room. Each word of gossip now stung Diane and Robert, not Margaret. The family's armor had cracked, and the crowd poured salt into every fracture. Margaret stood steady through it all, her hand resting lightly at her side, her gaze never wavering. She had no need to raise her voice further. Her truth had finally pierced the walls of her parents' denial, and the room itself carried her vindication. Diane's excuse rang hollow, Rachel's defense cut deep, Margaret's own words sealed the point, and Robert's silence, his refusal to stand by his daughter in the moment of reckoning, was the final judgment. The storm had broken, not in shouts, but in shame. It wasn't Margaret who bore it anymore. It was Diane and Robert, the architects of cruelty now trapped beneath the weight of their own collapse, while the guests they once sought to impress whispered against them. The whispers in the room had barely settled when the master of ceremonies clapped his hands, eager to move the evening along. He gestured toward the far wall where a large screen had been lowered, the projector humming to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a touch too cheerful, "please turn your attention to the slideshow. Let's take a moment to celebrate the bride and groom's journey together." His tone carried the optimism of a man trying to smooth over awkwardness, to shift the mood back toward celebration. Lights dimmed, and guests dutifully turned in their chairs, glad for a distraction from the storm that had just shaken the family. But in the quiet hum of anticipation, Maria slipped from her seat near the audio-visual booth. Calm, deliberate, she carried a small flash drive in her hand. Few noticed her as she leaned toward the technician, whispering something softly, then sliding the USB into place. The screen flickered. The room waited for baby pictures, for engagement shots, for smiling vacation snapshots. Instead, bold white text scrawled across a black background. "She made him up just to compete with Emily." A gasp rang out, sharp and sudden. The words hung on the screen like a slap. Confused laughter followed, then silence. Before anyone could process, another message appeared. Pathetic eldest daughter, always desperate for attention. Now the gasps turned into shouts of disbelief. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to determine what they were seeing. The slideshow was no slideshow at all. It was a transcript. A private conversation. Message after message rolled across the projection, cruel words displayed for all to see. Diane's name appeared beside lines mocking Margaret's Christmas card, calling her delusional. Emily's texts flashed up next, ridiculing her sister's absence at family dinners. Even Mark's name appeared, his words now damning in front of 200 witnesses. If she really has a husband, maybe he's too embarrassed to be seen with her. Laughter emojis followed, betraying not just cruelty, but camaraderie in their derision. Gasps gave way to murmurs. Some guests covered their mouths, others looked around in horror. The room had shifted again, and this time it was Diane, Emily, and Mark, caught in the merciless spotlight. The screen rolled on mercilessly. She bakes stories because she can't live her own life. She'll never measure up to Emily. Not in 1,000 years. Firstborn failure. The words seared through the crowd. Whispers turned sharp, directed now at the very people who had once led the ridicule. Women in sequin dresses shook their heads. Men who had once toasted Diane turned away from her. Every eye sought her out, burning holes through her practiced facade. Diane rose abruptly, her hands outstretched as if to physically stop the projection. This must be taken out of context, she stammered, but the screen betrayed her, line after line, appearing like evidence in a trial. Emily's cheeks flushed red, her perfect bridal smile gone, replaced by a twisted grimace. Mark stood rigid, jaw tight, realizing his cruel bravado was no longer a private joke but a public record. The MC looked helplessly at Maria, who remained composed at the booth, her lips pressed together in quiet resolve. She didn't announce what she had done. She didn't need to. The truth was there for everyone to read, raw and undeniable. The crowd turned as one. People who had once laughed at Margaret's supposed misfortune now fixed their gazes on the perpetrators. Conversations buzzed with indignation. How could they treat their own daughter that way? Someone whispered loudly. Humiliating her in front of everyone. And now this? Another added. The tide had turned completely. Sympathy, once withheld, now rushed toward Margaret like a flood. At the center of it all, Margaret did not move. She remained still, her expression calm, her silence more powerful than any speech she could have delivered. She didn't need to say, "I told you so." The screen spoke for her. The family who had mocked her was now mocked in turn, their words displayed in cold light, impossible to deny, impossible to excuse. The humiliation was no longer hers to bear. It had shifted, wholly and irreversibly, onto the ones who had wielded it as a weapon. Diane's protests died in her throat as no one came to her defense. Emily's hands trembled against her bouquet, the white roses quivering with each nervous breath. Mark tried to hold his composure, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. Their laughter, once sharp and merciless, had been flipped back upon them. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a courtroom, and the jury was unanimous. The whispers grew louder, the stares sharper, until it was clear to everyone. Those who had sneered were now the spectacle. The public humiliation had reversed, and there was no way back. In that moment, Margaret's vindication was complete. Not through shouting, not through rage, but through the unfiltered truth laid bare before every eye. She remained silent, allowing her parents, her sister, and the groom to drown in the very scorn they had once poured over her. The balance of the night had shifted once again, but this time it was final. They had mocked her as imaginary, as a fraud. Now, it was their cruelty that stood exposed, larger than life on a wedding screen, and it was they who became the punchline of their own joke. The ballroom seemed to collapse in on itself the moment the last words from the family chat disappeared from the screen. The laughter, the whispers, the shuffling of chairs, all of it was gone. For the first time that evening, 200 people sat in utter silence, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone like a verdict. Crystal glasses trembled in midair, as though the guests feared even the faintest clink would break the spell. The chandeliers glowed above, steady and merciless, illuminating every face that had moments before found humor in Margaret's pain. Now those same faces avoided her gaze, their bravado shrunk into stillness. Jonathan reached for her hand, his grip steady and warm. He leaned close enough for his words to belong to her, yet pitched them so the entire room could hear. "You don't need to prove anything anymore," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "They should be the ones ashamed." It was not a declaration of victory, not a flourish of triumph. It was a simple truth, stated plainly. and in that truth the balance of power shifted again. The sentence cut through the silence, like a bell tolling in a church, undeniable and final. Margaret did not answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she allowed a faint smile to settle on her lips, a smile born not of gloating but of release. She had no speech prepared, no demand for apologies. Her silence, paired with that smile, was stronger than any words could ever be. It told the room she had survived their ridicule, that she had stood through the storm without bowing, and now she was no longer the one on trial. The jury of peers had already delivered its judgment without her uttering a single word. The cost of that judgment was written clearly on the faces of those who had mocked her most. Mark, the confident groom, stood with his head bowed, the swagger drained from him, as if someone had cut the strings of a puppet. His earlier boast that he would kneel if Margaret's husband was real echoed now like a cruel joke on himself. He could not lift his eyes to meet hers, because to do so would be to admit the humiliation was deserved. Emily, radiant bride only moments earlier, raised trembling hands to shield her face, her bouquet crushed between her fingers. She had smirked when her mother called Margaret delusional. Now the smirk had rotted into something bitter, her shoulders shaking under the scrutiny of her guests. Diane, who had orchestrated years of dismissal, clutched the edge of the table for balance. Her pearls trembled against her throat, her carefully composed expression cracking under the weight of shame she could no longer disguise. And Robert, the father who had always chosen reputation over his eldest daughter, said nothing at all. His silence was not protective but damning, an admission that he had no defense. He studied the floor as if it might open and swallow him, but the floor stayed solid, and the stares of the guests only grew sharper. Around them, the silence deepened into something heavier. It was no longer the hush of anticipation, but the quiet of reckoning. Guests who had earlier chuckled behind their glasses now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unwilling to meet Margaret's eyes, yet unable to stop glancing at the disgraced family. A woman near the front pressed her lips together tightly, as though swallowing words she dared not say aloud. Margaret stood at the center of it all, unhurried, unbent. She had once been the object of ridicule, the family member whose absence was always explained away with sly jokes. Now she was the still point in a room full of chaos. She did not move to comfort, did not attempt to soften the blow. She simply existed, visible, undeniable, her presence the very thing they had tried so long to erase. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. The silence that once made her invisible now made her impossible to ignore. Jonathan tightened his hand around hers again, steadying her even though she no longer needed the support. He glanced at Diane and Robert briefly, then back to Margaret, letting the pause say more than words could. Together they embodied what the others had denied: unity, dignity, respect. For years Margaret had been painted as a woman desperate, clinging to fantasies. Yet the man at her side, real and unwavering, proved the lie with every breath he took in that room. No one spoke. The MC fidgeted with his microphone but dared not interrupt. The musicians kept their bows suspended above strings, unwilling to be the first to disturb what had settled over the crowd. The silence stretched, second by second, until it became something more than absence of sound. It became a sentence, a punishment, a mirror. Every person in that hall was forced to sit with the truth. Margaret had not been the liar, the pretender, the embarrassment. The ones who mocked her had been all those things, and now the silence left them nowhere to hide. Margaret's smile lingered. She turned her gaze briefly toward Mark, then Emily, then Diane, holding each just long enough for them to feel the weight of being seen. She said nothing, and yet the silence carried her message as clearly as if she had shouted. "You made me invisible. You called me a ghost, and now the whole room sees you for what you are." The hush that blanketed the ballroom was not awkward, not uncomfortable for her. It was sweet. It was the sound of scales finally balanced, of years of cruelty collapsing under their own weight. The sweetest revenge was not in shouting, not in demands or explanations. It was in standing still, silent, while the people who had scorned her trembled under the truth. And so Margaret held her silence, and the silence itself became her victory. The hush that had sealed the ballroom lingered even after the lights came back on, and the waiters began to move again. No one clapped, no one offered another toast, and no one dared to revive the laughter that had filled the evening just an hour before. Margaret and Jonathan stood together at the center, hand in hand, while the family who had ridiculed her wilted into shadows at the edges of the hall. That was how the wedding ended, not with cheers, but with the kind of silence that etches itself into memory. By the following morning, Margaret's phone lit up with messages from the parents who had spent years dismissing her. Diane's voice on voicemail was soft, coated in sugar, every syllable strained with false warmth. "Sweetheart, we've had a difficult night. Let's talk. Now that Jonathan is part of the family, we can put this behind us. Think of what we could accomplish together." Minutes later, Robert sent a blunt text. "Jonathan has influence. It would be smart for us to meet. There are opportunities here." For years, Margaret would have clung to any scrap of their attention. This time, she listened to her mother's voice, read her father's words, and felt nothing but clarity. Their sudden interest wasn't love. It was calculation. They wanted Jonathan's reach, not her respect. She thought of the years when her achievements had been brushed aside, her voice cut short at Christmas, her dreams dismissed at the dinner table. She thought of the cruel messages on the group chat, projected for everyone to see. And she thought of the vows she had made silently in that ballroom. Never again would she live as the daughter who had to beg for dignity. She opened her phone, typed slowly, and let the steel in her resolve guide her words. "I will only return when respect is freely given. Until then, I need nothing from you." She did not add an apology, did not dress it up in explanations. It was not anger, it was a line drawn, finally and irrevocably. That evening, she and Jonathan attended a reception in the city. This time, the crowd gathered not to mock her, but to seek her out. Colleagues and acquaintances who had seen her composure at the wedding came forward with questions about her work. A magazine editor praised her designs and hinted at a feature spread. A venture capitalist remarked that anyone who could endure humiliation with such poise had the instincts of a true leader. Margaret handed out her business card again and again, each exchange a small act of vindication. Where once she had been invisible, she was now in demand. And through it all, Jonathan stayed close but let her shine, content to watch her be recognized in her own right. When the night ended, a car carried them back to the helipad. The wind from the blades whipped around her hair as she climbed in, but Margaret felt steady, grounded. On the ground below, Diane and Robert stood at the edge of the estate's lawn. Their faces were pale, their eyes desperate, their posture stiff with pride they could no longer afford. Emily clutched Mark's arm, her veil askew, while he stood rigid and hollow, still weighed down by the promise he could not fulfill. None of them waved. None dared call out. They simply stared as the machine roared to life, the downdraft scattering rose petals across the grass like fragments of a ceremony that no longer belonged to them. Margaret leaned back in her seat, Jonathan's hand covering hers. Through the glass she saw the figures of her family growing smaller, swallowed by distance and darkness. Their power over her was gone. Their scorn no longer mattered. The helicopter lifted higher, carrying her toward a life they could not shape or deny. She smiled not in triumph, not in cruelty, but in peace. For the first time, she was free of the weight she had carried since childhood. The sweetest revenge was never in shouting, never in demanding apologies. It was not in proving them wrong with speeches, or in meeting cruelty with rage. It was in living so fully, so undeniably, that even the harshest critics were left powerless, forced to watch a truth they could no longer twist. And as the lights of the city spread out before her, Margaret knew she had claimed that revenge at last. The story you have just witnessed is not only about humiliation and revenge, it is about dignity reclaimed, boundaries drawn, and the strength to stand tall, even when those closest to you try to tear you down. Margaret's silence spoke louder than any outburst, and her resolve proved stronger than years of ridicule. In the end, the family who mocked her was forced to watch as the truth they denied stood right before them. And perhaps that is the lesson we all must remember. The sweetest revenge is not in shouting, but in living a life that no one can dismiss. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Was Margaret right to cut ties and set clear boundaries with her parents? Or should family always be given another chance, no matter the past? Your perspective matters, and your stories bring these lessons to life. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful tales of betrayal, redemption, and justice every week. Stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, truth has a way of shining through. Click the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. And remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge is not in what you say, but in how you choose to live.